President Biden is now expressing support for a ceasefire between the militant group Hamas and Israel. It comes just a day after the U.S. voted against a UN statement calling for a ceasefire. The U.S. is now seeking answers after a building housing the AP and Al Jazeera offices was blown up in the middle of the conflict. And what does the U.S. seeking to re-enter the 2015 Iran nuclear deal potentially play a part in the U.S. stance? Tune in to Deep Dive as we explore these topics and more. Hello and welcome. This is Deep Dive and I'm Tiffany Meier. All eyes seem to be on what's happening in Israel. Many world players weighing in, including President Biden. Biden is expressing support for a ceasefire between the militant group Hamas and Israel. Biden also doubled down on his, quote, firm support for Israel's right to defend itself against indiscriminate rocket attacks. That's a position the administration has held since fighting began on May 10th. That's when Palestinian rioters and Israeli police clashed in and around a mosque. That also coincided with a planned Jewish nationalist march and the Muslim fasting month. Biden's comments come after pressure from a group of Democrats. Senator Jon Ossoff led 28 Senate Democrats in a joint statement Sunday, urging for an immediate ceasefire agreement in Israel and the Palestinian territories to prevent further loss of life and further escalation of violence. This comes as 19 Senate Republicans introduced a resolution on Monday to reaffirm the United States' unequivocal support for Israel's right to defend itself. There was no mention of support for a ceasefire. Senator Rick Scott is leading that effort. He said in a statement, "Let's remember what we are witnessing. These are terrorists ruthlessly attacking an ally. Defense of these terrorists is unthinkable." The resolution is said to be introduced in Congress this week. In the resolution, the U.S. Senate opposes the escalating and indiscriminate rocket attacks by Hamas against Israel and mourns the loss of innocent life caused by Hamas's rocket attacks. The Senate also urges continued and steadfast support for Israel and reaffirms its strong support for Israel's right to peace and security. Now, this comes in contrast to what happened over the weekend. On Sunday, the U.S. took actions to block a joint statement from the 15-nation UN Security Council, calling for a ceasefire and condemnation of Israel's military response to being attacked. China and other nations at the UN Security Council back the ceasefire. They also want to condemn Israel's military response to being attacked. The U.S. has blocked similar resolutions twice over the past week. Now the U.S. is seeking answers about Israel's bombing of a building in Gaza that housed Al Jazeera and the Associated Press. Israel says Hamas was using the building. Hamas is an Iran-backed and funded terrorist organization that seized power of Gaza in 2007. Amid missiles fired from both sides, Israel took action. It leveled a building housing news outlets such as the Associated Press and Al Jazeera. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu defended the strike, saying on CBS Sunday, "We make sure everyone is gone." Israeli military gave the building occupants a full hour to evacuate before destroying the high-rise structure. The official defense account of the Israeli military explained the process of how they deal with a Hamas military location, which is often hidden among civilian buildings. It states, depending on the target, some measures include planning the angle, time of the attack, operational analysis of expected civilian harm, advanced warning, and roof knocking. The Associated Press and Al Jazeera both responded with separate statements about the hit. AP's statement reads, "We are shocked and horrified that the Israeli military would target and destroy the building housing AP's bureau and other news organizations in Gaza. They have long known the location of our bureau and knew journalists were there. We received a warning that the building would be hit." Now, U.S. lawmakers are seeking answers. Senator Jack Reed says the Israelis must produce adequate evidence that there was Hamas operating the building, that it was a legitimate military target. An Israeli official says the evidence he's seen is crystal clear. He says they've already shared the evidence with the U.S. government, and he says he thinks it is only a matter of time before all relevant U.S. officials see it. Republican Senator Tom Cotton, meanwhile, is asking a different question. He asks, why is the Associated Press sharing a building with Hamas? Did they knowingly allow themselves to be used as human shields by a U.S.-designated terrorist organization? Cotton also questions the AP's reporting on Hamas and says the news outlet has some uncomfortable questions to answer. The AP maintains it didn't know Hamas was using the building. Over the weekend, the Israeli army faked their ground invasion into the Gaza Strip. They did that through a misdirection on social media. It led to Hamas hiding their weaponry underground. Israel then launched an intense bombing of the tunnels, as well as carrying out targeted assassinations on key leaders of Hamas. The AFP reports German Chancellor Angela Merkel voiced solidarity with Israel, while also expressing the loss of lives on both sides. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken on Monday urged Israel and Palestinians to protect civilians, especially children, reiterating that Israel, as a democracy, has an extra burden to do so. Former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, meanwhile, said on a show, the Iranians have made clear they have genocidal intent, and they want to wipe Israel off the face of the planet, and they use proxy forces, people like the Palestinian Islamic Jihad and Hamas. Now, some have been saying the Biden administration is rather low-key about this matter, seemingly not offending either party. CNBC did a piece on why the Iran nuclear deal will undercut the effort to end the conflict between the two states. Biden has been pushing for the U.S. to rejoin the 2015 Iran nuclear deal. Then President Trump withdrew from it in 2018. Trump said it would give Iran billions of dollars, yet failed to stop the regime from developing ballistic missiles. Senior Vice President of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, Jonathan Schanzer, told CNBC that Washington's silence may have something to do with the Iran nuclear deal. That's because returning to the deal would result in Iran receiving billions of dollars in sanctions relief in exchange for limiting its nuclear program. Tehran could use that money to fund the militants, since Iran is Hamas's top sponsor. He added that the U.S. would inadvertently find itself indirectly supporting both sides of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, meaning undermining the Israel-U.S. relationship while also funding Hamas, but also funding Israel's war supplies too. This would make the U.S.'s position on this issue, ironically, very immature. According to Reuters, the U.S. last week objected to efforts by the United Nations Security Council to issue a public statement on Israeli-Palestinian tensions, worrying that a statement could hurt behind-the-scenes diplomacy. This could be one reason why Blinken was so reactive to the leveling of the office building hosting AP and Al Jazeera, because suddenly now the U.S. has to play double diplomacy with Hamas's backer, Iran and Israel. That means the U.S. either drops the obsession with the Iran nuclear deal or they risk losing Israel's alliance. Now let's take a moment for a brief history of Israel. Many think about the years after World War II ended. That's when Israel officially became the first and only Jewish state in an area sought after by many. Now, modern-day Israel is home to historically important sites like Jerusalem, a city that many wanted to call their own. Throughout its long history, Jerusalem has been besieged 23 times. Other important sites include Islam's third most holy mosque, as well as the church where Jesus was laid to rest. Not only Jerusalem, but the entire land of Israel is of great importance for many different cultures. But the creation of modern-day Israel actually dates back further, about half a century earlier, around 1900. The founder of the Zionist movement is believed to be the Austrian journalist Theodor Herzl. The nationalist movement promotes the idea of returning the Jews to their homeland. It all started with a few Jews from Europe who went to the Middle East, bought land from the Arabs, and started to settle down. Between 1881 and the 1930s, more and more Jews settled down in the area. They came in 5 waves, each bigger than the last. The first wave consisted of about 30,000 people, whereas the 5th wave in the 1930s brought 250,000 Jews to the area. By that time, the local Arabs had already built up anger for the new population and had set limitations in place that meant to restrict more Jews from coming. That 5th wave of Jews resulted in the Arab Revolt in 1936, which went on for 3 years. After the Second World War ended, most Jews didn't want to live in Europe anymore after the brutal persecution there for the past decade. The United Nations voted on whether the Jews should get their own state in the Middle East. The vote turned out to be in favor for Israel, and one could say that's how the nation was officially created. But for the Arabs who felt betrayed and that their land had been stolen, they immediately declared war on Israel. So what Israelis consider Independence Day means the beginning of what Arabians see as the brutal persecution against their own. Arabian nations, especially Palestine, have been in war with Israel ever since, although it is not a constant battle. Most of the time it's not active, like right now. But tensions and random attacks from either side simmer regularly. This is just a very brief overview. Well, what do you think? Let me know below. Thanks for tuning in to Deep Dive. I'm Tiffany Meier, and see you soon.